Something happened at exactly 2:14 p.m. today that may one day be written about in history books. And yet if you turn on the news tonight, you'll probably hear it described as nothing more than a heated disagreement between two leaders. They'll say it was a clash of personalities. They'll say it was tension. They'll say it was political drama. But what happened inside the West Wing was not drama. It was a fracture. A crack in a system that has defined North America for over 70 years. Mark Carney walked out of a meeting with the President of the United States. No shouting, no dramatic exit, no slammed doors. He stood up, gathered his papers, and left. That quiet decision carried more weight than any speech, because this wasn't about hurt feelings, it wasn't about ego, and it certainly wasn't about a bad meeting. This was about power, about control, about a country that has long believed it sets the rules, suddenly discovering those rules don't work anymore. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Canada has been described as a partnership. Friendly neighbors, shared borders, shared values, deep trade integration. But if you look closely at the numbers, at the flow of goods, at the movement of capital, you see something different. Canada supplies resources: oil, lumber, minerals, energy. The United States supplies capital, financial systems, and consumption power. It has never truly been equal. It has been polite. It has been quiet. But it has never been equal, and today that quiet management broke down. Behind closed doors, the U.S. administration presented something called the Northern Alignment Protocol. The name sounds harmless, technical, strategic, but in the language of power, alignment rarely means cooperation. It means falling in line. According to reports, this document demanded three major concessions from Canada: control over energy exports, adoption of American trade tariffs, and the pegging of the Canadian dollar to the US dollar. That is not partnership, that is economic surrender. This wasn't negotiation, it was a test. And Donald Trump believed Canada would fold. Why? Because historically smaller economies do. Because the American market is massive. Because the US dollar has dominated global trade for generations. Because for 70 years American pressure usually worked. But something has changed. When Carney looked at that document, he wasn't seeing an opportunity. He was seeing instability. He was seeing unpredictability. He was seeing a demand rooted in desperation. And he understood something critical. If Canada agreed, it would not be stabilizing North America. It would be tying itself to a system that is wobbling. So instead of arguing, instead of escalating, he did something more powerful. He refused. The moment he walked out, financial markets reacted. The US dollar dipped. The S&P 500 slid. Investors recalculated risk in real time. Not because of emotion, because they sensed something structural. The United States had attempted to force economic submission from its closest ally, and failed. And when a dominant power fails publicly, it exposes vulnerability. That's what made 2:14 p.m. so significant. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it signaled something that hasn't been visible in decades. The leverage may not be where Washington thinks it is anymore. And here's the question you should be asking. If Canada can say no, who else might? Because this moment may not be about one meeting. It may be about the beginning of a new chapter, one where economic power is no longer automatic. Stay with me, because once you understand what was actually inside that document, you'll see why this wasn't just a disagreement. It was a warning shot. And not in the direction people assume. The document they didn't want you to see. Let's slow down and look carefully at what was actually being demanded. Because the details matter. The second major demand inside the Northern Alignment Protocol was this: Canada must implement a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles and battery components. On the surface, this sounds strategic, protective, even patriotic. But look deeper. Electric vehicles are the future of transportation. They're central to climate goals. They're central to global competition. And China currently produces many of them at lower cost and increasing quality. If Canada purchases affordable EVs and batteries, it lowers transportation costs. It accelerates adoption, it reduces consumer prices, but Washington demanded that Canada block those imports entirely. Why? Because American automakers are struggling to compete. For decades, major U.S. corporations prioritized short-term stock buybacks over long-term innovation. Instead of reinvesting profits into research and development, they boosted share prices. Now competition has caught up. Instead of adapting, they are seeking protection. Trump's demand was simple. Canada must make its own economy less efficient in order to protect American corporations. Think about that. Not mutual growth, not joint innovation, but deliberate self-limitation. Carney understood immediately what this meant. It wasn't about security. It wasn't about protecting jobs in Canada. It was about transferring economic cost from American companies onto Canadian consumers. And that's just one section. The next demand was even more serious. Energy export caps. The United States wanted influence over how much oil and energy Canada could sell and where. Energy is not just a commodity, it is leverage, it is geopolitical power, it is economic stability. By demanding control over export volumes, Washington was essentially asking Canada to surrender control over one of its most powerful industries. That is not a trade adjustment. That is colonial behavior without troops. For decades, similar strategies were applied to Latin America and the Middle East. Resource control without formal invasion. Influence without flag raising. Now, for the first time in modern history, that strategy was pointed north. And then came the most critical demand, the currency peg. Tying the Canadian dollar to the US dollar would eliminate independent monetary policy. If the US Federal Reserve raised interest rates, Canada would have to follow. If the US economy overheated, Canada would absorb the shock. Currency sovereignty is national sovereignty. Control the currency, control the economy. Carney, a former central banker, understood this instantly. A currency peg would effectively turn Canada into an economic extension of Washington. And here's the irony. This demand came at a moment when global trust in the US dollar is quietly being questioned. Rising debt levels, increasing political instability, growing geopolitical tensions. To tie yourself permanently to a system under stress is not stability, it's risk, and so Carney did what technocrats rarely do publicly. He said no, not loudly, not theatrically, but decisively, and in doing so he forced markets to confront a reality that has been building for years. American economic dominance is not automatic anymore. Why the empire overplayed its hand. Empires don't collapse quietly. They become aggressive first. History shows us that declining powers often take bigger risks. They demand more. They escalate faster. Because deep down, they sense loss. The United States is facing multiple pressures at once. Rising national debt, industrial hollowing, political paralysis, widening inequality, a deeply divided electorate. For decades, American growth relied on expansion, new markets, new influence, new financial dominance. But domestic markets are saturated, consumers are buried in debt, infrastructure is aging, wages have stagnated. When internal growth slows, capital looks outward. The Northern Alignment Protocol was an outward move, not against an enemy, against a partner. And that's what makes this moment so revealing. Because Canada is not hostile territory, it is deeply integrated. Supply chains run north-south, energy grids are interconnected, manufacturing crosses borders daily. By pressuring Canada aggressively, Washington wasn't threatening an opponent. It was destabilizing its own network. Markets recognize that immediately. Capital is pragmatic. It doesn't care about flags. It cares about predictability. If the United States becomes volatile, if policy becomes erratic, capital migrates, and that possibility is what shook investors. The walkout wasn't just a diplomatic embarrassment. It signaled that leverage may be shifting in subtle but important ways. And here's the deeper issue. If Canada can resist pressure successfully, other allies may rethink their own dependencies. Europe, Japan, emerging economies, they are watching. The United States has long been the center of the global economic web. But webs require trust, stability, reliability. If threads begin to fray, the entire structure weakens. Trump believed pressure would demonstrate strength. Instead, it revealed limits. And that may be the most dangerous realization of all. Because once limits are visible, they are tested. WHO really pays, and what comes next? Now let's talk about the part that affects you. Because while leaders argue and markets react, ordinary people absorb the consequences. Trade disputes raise prices. Currency instability increases volatility. Energy disruptions raise utility bills. The auto worker in Ontario doesn't benefit from tariff escalation. The nurse in New York doesn't gain from currency shocks. Families trying to afford groceries don't win from geopolitical standoffs. Elite conflicts rarely improve working-class stability. And that's the uncomfortable truth. This wasn't about helping workers in Detroit. It wasn't about protecting families in Alberta. It was about competing visions of power among elites. One faction favors protectionist nationalism. The other favors globalized finance. Neither fundamentally restructures the system for everyday people. But here's where hope enters the picture. Moments like this expose a fragility. When dominant systems show strain, it reminds people that power structures are not permanent. They are constructed, and what is constructed can be changed. Carney's walkout demonstrated that resistance is possible even within elite circles. It proved that pressure does not always succeed, and that realization travels. The coming months will likely bring volatility. Rhetoric will intensify. Media narratives will push citizens toward anger and nationalism. Be cautious. When leaders tell you to blame neighbors, it often masks deeper structural problems. The American worker has more in common with the Canadian worker than either has with billionaires in boardrooms. Energy grids, trade routes, and currencies are tools. The question is, who do they ultimately serve? If this moment teaches anything, it's this. Power is shifting. Not dramatically overnight, but gradually. And when systems shift, the future is not predetermined. It is negotiated. The quiet era of unquestioned dominance is ending. What replaces it is still uncertain. But one thing is clear. 2:14 p.m. was not a personality clash. It was a signal. And history may look back on it as the moment the balance began to change. If you found this breakdown valuable, comment below. Do you think this was strength or desperation? Because the next phase of this story is already unfolding. And we will be watching closely.